Hello and a very warm welcome. I'm Andrew Whitehead, and for the next half hour or so, I'm going to be in conversation with the eminent broadcaster, journalist, and author Mihir Bose about his new book. This is it. It is Narendra Modi, the Yogi of Populism. It's published by Bite-Sized Books, and it is exactly that. It's bite-sized. It's a very snappy, eloquent, and effervescent, I'd say 58 pages. I'm going to put some questions to Mihir about the book and his views of Narendra Modi. And I'm also very happy to put your questions to Mihir. So if you have questions, the best way of sharing them is by posting a comment on the Bite-Sized Books YouTube channel. But first, Mihir, welcome. And in the bite-sized spirit, I'm going to give you just 2 minutes to sum up the principal arguments of your book.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Wonderful to be with you. And I see you're wearing a Nehru jacket, or perhaps it should be called a Modi jacket. Basically, my argument is, and this struck me after Modi won power and then Trump and Boris Johnson, that Modi has actually provided the template for populists to win power. And what do I mean by that? I mean that Modi has convinced a lot of people, a lot of Hindus in India, that they have lost their country. They need to regain their country, and Modi is a savior who will regain their country for them. And secondly, that of course he will bring economic prosperity. So if you like, he's riding two bicycles at the same time. And if you look, that's what Trump did. And that to an extent is what Johnson has done. Trump said he wanted to regain the country for the whites who had lost out from the swamp in Washington, and of course bring economic prosperity. And Johnson's slogan was, take control for winning the Brexit referendum, and of course prosperity. And it's very interesting to compare Trump and Modi. Trump's great slogan was "Build the Wall," to keep all these Mexican immigrants, rapists, whatever they were, that he alleged were coming over. And Modi's slogan was build the temple, this temple being in Ayodhya, which of course Hindus claim that the Mughal Emperor Babur had destroyed in all those centuries ago and built a mosque. So if you like, this is the template. And that's what I wanted to talk about, of how, if you like, in America and in the UK, one wouldn't think of an Indian politician providing a model, but I think Modi has, and it is working.
That's a really fascinating argument, a model, a template for populism. But are you saying that Modi and Trump and Johnson are part of the same global trend? Or are you suggesting that in some measure that Trump and Boris have modeled themselves actively, have sought to emulate Narendra Modi?
Well, I think both. I think that both of them have looked at this template. I mean, that's what populists do. They want to appeal, but they've looked at this template, I think, and said, yes, this can be a winning formula. If you can convince a lot of people you've lost your country, that strikes a chord. And that is a very basic thing. Of course, you must also provide them or promise them economic prosperity. And I think they must have looked at that formula, because this is a formula. And is it a global trend? If you look around many parts of the world, particularly in Europe, this seems to be becoming a trend, and which for me is very distressing.
But you can see how much Trump and Boris appear to have in common in their style, in their persona, in the way that they've lived their lives to some extent. But Narendra Modi, I mean, he's a man of faith. He's been celibate for most of his adult life. He lives fairly austerely. None of this could possibly be said of either Donald Trump or Boris Johnson. So aren't you stretching the argument a little bit?
Oh, no, I don't mean in personal terms they are the same, but I'm talking in broad terms of how you use political slogans, how you use them to appeal to a section of the audience who feel, a section of the populace who feel they have been ignored, they haven't been listened to, they haven't had a voice, and how do you appeal to them? And that is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking, yes, in personal terms, Modi is not at all like Trump and Johnson. Modi hasn't had a string of affairs. Johnson has also had a string of affairs. That nothing like that. His marriage was a very curious one. He hardly had a marriage and things like that. And also, he's different to other Indian politicians, which is part of his appeal in India, that he has not promoted his family because he doesn't really have a family. If you look at other politicians, particularly Congress politicians, they have made politics a family business. The husband goes, the wife, who's never been heard of before, takes over, which has been which has happened. The sons take over, and of course, the worst example that one can give is of the Gandhi Nehru family, where the Congress party is still in thrall to that dynasty. And Modi keeps away from that. Though I don't think either, well, Trump may be promoting a family dynasty. It's hard to say, who knows? There's talk that Trump's son-in-law or eventually his son would try and take power. We haven't heard of Boris Johnson's children, but then Boris Johnson doesn't tell us how many children he has. So it's a bit difficult to know who might succeed him.
Okay, I'm not sure we're going to go there, but one of the things that Narendra Modi has done, and it's arguably at the heart of his populist style of approach, is othering a large part of Indian citizens, India's very large Muslim minority, in a way that neither Boris Johnson nor Donald Trump have sought to do. But politically, it's been very effective for him.
Yes, it has, and this again is part of the message that he's got through to the Hindus. I describe in my book back in '81 when I arrived in India to cover the England-India series, and I was going back to the city where I grew up, Bombay, as it was called Mumbai now, and over Kemp's Corner, which was the first flyover ever built in the city, I saw a slogan saying, "Mrs. Gandhi, save the Hindus," and I couldn't understand what Mrs. Gandhi was in the Prime Minister, but basically what Narendra Modi has done is take up that cry, saving the Hindus, and that means demonizing the Muslims. The India I grew up in was the secular India of Jawaharlal Nehru. You might say it was militant secularism, where even anybody talking about religion was condemned as a communalist, which is the Indian word for a religious bigot. It's as bad a word in India, or used to be as bad a word in India as the word racist is now in the West. But what Modi has done in Mumbai now, really, there is segregation by religion. I've heard, and a very good friend of mine, a very old school friend of mine, who's also a Muslim and a lawyer, the last time I was there, was telling me how if you go to buy a flat in Mumbai, and you buy by color or by looking at a person, you don't know what their religion is, and the guy says, yes, fine, you can buy the flat, you've got to pay so much money, maybe so much in white money, so much in black money, and all that, as happens in India. And then they say, what's your name? And they give a Muslim name, Muhammad so and so, whatever. And they say, sorry, you can't come in. And that is something that has happened. I mean, that was happening to an extent even before Modi took power, but that has gone further. And now, if a Muslim marries a Hindu, they talk about love jihad. When I was growing up, the great Indian cricketer was Nawab Patodi, one of the most charismatic cricketers in the history of Indian cricket. He married Sharmila Tagore from the Tagore family, who actually converted. And, okay, there was some muttering about it, but nobody saw it as love jihad. And I think that sort of thing it's very distressing to watch.
But that was an elite marriage, and that doesn't obey the same social etiquette and protocols as the lives of the poor. And love jihad is about stopping marriages, particularly in the villages and among the lower middle class, where in fact there isn't much of a tradition of marriage between Hindus and Muslims.
No, there isn't much of a tradition, and that is really the point. That the fact that love jihad has been taken up as a cry of the BJP shows what they've done is they have postulated that a Muslim wants to marry a Hindu girl and produce children and increase the population, Muslim population of India. And I have found a lot of people, friends of mine that I've known for years, have now started taking very anti-Muslim attitudes, which wasn't there. When I was growing up, my mother, who was a very religious woman, used to pray to Goddess Lakshmi every morning, the goddess of wealth. But in the same room where the statue of Goddess Lakshmi was, there was a statue of a Muslim Baba who she used to go to. In fact, the Muslim Baba would bless a water, and she would bring back the bottle of water. So in the morning we would have the blessings from Goddess Lakshmi. In the evening we would have the sip of water from this Muslim Baba, and that coexisted. And I think that is fraying. That sort of, I mean, you know India very well, and Hinduism, for all its things, is a broad church and tolerant. One could say Hinduism is not a religion; it's more of a cuisine. It provides a five course meal after prayers. But nevertheless, it has been a broad church, accommodating all sorts of things, and I think that is actually now being torn apart under the pressure exerted by the BJP and by Modi.
But some would say this terrible polarization between the Hindu majority and the Muslim minority arose at partition, with a deep sense of abiding grievance, particularly in North India and in areas such as where your forebears came from in Bengal. And do you see that there is a sort of thread, a rather unfortunate thread running from 1947 to where we are now?
Oh yes, I think partition has cast a shadow. I mean, my family, as you say, came from Bengal. They actually came from what was East Bengal, which is now Bangladesh, and we were jamindars, landlords, had lots of property, things like that. We lost everything, but my father never brought me up to hate the Muslims. He had Muslim friends, we had Muslim friends. They came to our house, and Eid and so on were wonderful things for her, because at the end of when Eid was celebrated, we'd get lovely biryani, and nobody makes biryani as well as good as the Muslims, and things like that. But that sort of social connection, I think, is again going. But I tell you what has happened. It has not been helped, if you look at the historical picture, by what Rajiv Gandhi did when in that famous case
Well, the Shah
where.
Banu case.
Yeah, Shah Banu case, where a Muslim woman won a Supreme Court verdict that her rights as a divorced woman had to be respected, and that is where he made a mistake, a tremendous mistake for political reasons, for which has helped the BJP tremendously, because at the moment the civil law that is there, as we all know, in India, the Muslims can marry four wives, because actually during British rule there wasn't a uniform civil law, and that, I think, and that, if you want to trace it back, goes back to Nehru and so on. They should have had a uniform civil law, and the BJP has used that argument ferociously.
So you would endorse Modi's ambition for a uniform civil code and the ending of religious personal law?
I would absolutely. I mean, if you're a citizen of a country like in this country, and if I become a Muslim, not that I want to, I wouldn't want four wives. I mean, but I I couldn't get four wives. I mean, you should have a uniform civil law. Otherwise, how can you call it a country?
But I mean, the title of your book is Narendra Modi, the Yogi of Populism. And yogi is an unusual word because actually it suggests a certain mysticism. And actually, arguably, Modi isn't very mystical at all. He's an extremely hard-headed and successful politician. He understands power.
Yes, he's a very successful politician, but he very cleverly uses India's sort of, yogi-like historical figures. For instance, one of his great heroes is Vivekananda, who was, this great figure who made Hinduism, if you like, brought Hinduism to the West, went to America, and so on, gave that great speech in Chicago where he addressed the audience as my brothers and sisters and so on. And Modi uses that, and if you like, when I say he's the yogi of populism, yogis are associated with being missionaries, and Modi has made it his job to try and cultivate America. He went to America before he came to Britain. We all remember his coming to Wembley, where David Cameron was there, who spoke a few words of Gujarati, and his wife
Very few
Samantha
words.
was there, and who wore a sari and things like that, and remarkable scenes. I mean, as I felt at the time, the Indian football team wouldn't be good enough to play at Wembley, but there was a big enough crowd of Indians at Wembley. But the point is that Modi does have that sort of, if you like, Hindu missionary zeal of Vivekananda, spread the word and things like that. So in that sense, and if you like, he has also made yoga an international yoga day at the UN. So if you like, he uses Indian soft power in the way that other Indian prime ministers don't. And this is where the duality of Modi comes in. As a politician, he can be ruthless. He can really go in and you know how to use political power. And he's proved to be the Teflon man. I mean, there have been many failures of Modi, demonetization, even the handling of COVID has not been a great success. You know, the disastrous scenes that were there when there was a lockdown. But Modi's personal popularity hasn't been affected.
But why is that? Because, as you say, he's done things which have caused a great deal of anguish and hardship to many Indians, particularly those who are less prosperous, the ones at the sharp end of demonetization, the migrant workers who were more or less abandoned when the lockdown was introduced, a very far-reaching lockdown to try and stop COVID spreading. Yet somehow it doesn't affect his personal standing. Is that simply because the opposition is just so weak in India?
Well, the opposition is weak. The Congress party doesn't seem to be able to wake up and realize that if it has got to be a political party, it can't be tied to a family. But if you see, this is where Modi links up with Trump and Johnson. You know, Trump didn't have great successes at times. I mean, but Trump never lost his popularity with his supporters. And Johnson's handling of COVID has come in for a lot of criticism. Yet Johnson himself is riding high. Okay, he's had a bit of a vaccine bounce, but even when the test and trace thing wasn't working in the early days of COVID, the handling was disastrous. Johnson's popularity wasn't affected. I remember talking to various people, and they said, "No, Boris is doing a great job." And that, I think, what one finds. I remember being in India when demonetization took place, and some people died. They couldn't get cash. You know, overnight this happened. It was very badly handled. And while they were critical of the government, didn't criticize Modi. They saw Modi as separate from the government. You know, as if Modi was not the government. He was the great. This is where the word Yogi, the great Yogi-like figure, above it all. You know, who was doing this thing.
And he's something of an enigma because famously he started off as a chaiwala. He helped his father run a railway station tea stall in a fairly small and insignificant town in Gujarat. It wasn't a privileged upbringing, hugely different from the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty. But yet, although he comes across as a modest person who lives in an austere manner, there is a cult of personality which is developing quite markedly now.
Oh yes, indeed. In fact, the jacket you're wearing should really be called the Modi jacket. With you know, I'm not sure if
I'm
you have
wearing
the
a
Modi.
Nehru jacket. I'm wearing a Nehru jacket.
You know, people would say you should have the name Modi there, but you know, he does use his personality. For instance, he is very adept. Despite being a chaiwala, a tea seller, he's very adept at using social media. He uses the Twitter account, and when he campaigned for prime ministership in 2014, he engaged people who knew how to use Twitter, social media, and so on in a way that no other Indian politician has done. But also the other thing about his being a tea seller, and this is important, Modi is actually the voice of people who hate the old, if you like, colonial hangover, the brown sahibs as they were called, the people who basically had benefited from British rule and then carried on what he calls the Lutyens elite. Lutyen, of course, being the man who designed New Delhi. And what is he doing now, Modi? Modi is going to build a new New Delhi, a Modi-style New Delhi. And in a sense, that is appealing to these people. And when I grew up in India, I remember I went to a English-speaking school, English medium school, a Jesuit school, and we used to look down on people who couldn't speak English properly. And Modi is really saying to his followers, look, these people, and this is very similar to what Trump said, the swamp in Washington, and to an extent Boris Johnson, though being an Etonian, you know, who likes to go to Greek and Latin, think of him as a man of the people would be wrong. But even then, you know, he did win red wall seats in this country by appealing to the people and saying, I'm against the metropolitan elite. So if you like, the Lutyens elite that Modi talks about is the metropolitan elite that Trump and Johnson talk about.
But don't you think, arguably, more than 70 years after India gained independence, it is time for independent India to have its own parliament building rather than simply the hand-me-down from the British?
Well, India should, yes, I entirely agree. But what India didn't do when it got independence, it didn't have an audit of what had been left behind. What it basically did was it carried on with the British laws. And some of these laws were built for the colonial regime. And some of these laws, for instance, allow very easily for books to be banned. I mean, I've myself suffered from it, and other people have, that sort of thing. So the laws and other things were not modified, and I'm not sure Modi is looking at that. Modi is not looking at the legal system in India, which needs to be reformed. I mean, court cases in India take years. I mean, you don't want to go to lawyers, and because Indian lawyers, being are very happy to drag on the case year after year, and those basic fundamental reforms are not taking place. Modi is building things, if you like, the great stadium that he renovated, the cricket stadium, which was named after his hero Sardar Patel. And then, of course, the first day of the Test match against England, the third Test match, which has recently taken place, it was renamed the Narendra Modi Stadium. So he is a man who likes to be associated with glitz and glamour. He might be a simple tea seller. He plays both cards there. He's a simple tea seller who can appeal to people who don't speak English, who don't live in the big cities, who come from the small towns and the villages. And yet he's a man who's showing them, even if you come from there, you can have a huge statue named after you, or a huge building erected in your honor.
And he has personal style. He dresses very smartly. He's well groomed.
Well, he spends a lot of money on that.
Just to say, if anybody does want me to ask any questions to Mihir, the best way of posing those questions is to put a comment on the Bite-Sized Books YouTube channel. And we are getting some questions coming in. One here: has India's social cohesion, and the question says, Gandhi said Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Parsis and Christians all lived side by side in the same village. Has that social cohesion been permanently damaged by Modi's militant Hinduism?
Well, I hope it hasn't been permanently damaged, but it is getting frayed. The Hindus now see themselves as an evangelical body in the way that they never did before. The Hindus see themselves, for instance, the Hindus are going around, and many Hindus are doing it, reconverting, what they call welcoming back people who become Muslims, and so on and so forth. And really, this is all, even Christians, but basically it's targeted at Muslims, and they say this: oh no, we're not reconverting, we're just welcoming them back home, as if to say that they were all Hindus, and therefore you can only be a Hindu to be a full citizen. And I think this is being very, very seriously frayed. Of course, India is a diverse country. In the south of India, the spread of the BJP is limited. It's still mainly in the north. But what has surprised me is to see in Bengal, the province that my ancestors come from, which used to be dominated by the left. The Communist Party held power there for more than 30 years. And now the BJP could win local elections, which state elections, which would have been unthinkable a few years ago. So that is where the attitudes are changing, and people are taking religion as a political thing in the way that they were not taking, certainly even a few years ago.
And we've had another question, which I think is very pertinent. Do you see any way that Modi can be defeated at the next election? And who is the opposition now in India?
Well, the only way Modi could be defeated is if the Congress party realize that it cannot function in the way it is, find a leader that responds to what is needed. I mean, and the other way would be if there were regional parties that could threaten the BJP. But at the moment, that doesn't look likely, certainly not in the north. Maybe in the south, the regional parties are still strong, but in the north, it doesn't look like the BJP is threatened. But that could fracture. At the moment, Modi has power on his own, so there isn't a coalition in operation. But what is needed, first of all, is the Congress Party, which has still got some support, but which can revive and reconnect with the people if it found a proper leader.
But Congress is barely a nationwide party. It only has a handful of chief ministers in the almost 30 Indian states. Nobody's sure who leads the Congress party. Isn't it time for a new nationwide political formation to tackle the BJP?
Absolutely, there is need, but it has to be built up from some sort of base. The Congress Party could provide some sort of base to be built up. But again, what sort of slogans would it unite under? You see, Modi's BJP slogans are very clear. And they are very direct, if you like, the way Article 370 on Kashmir was revoked, and the special privileges that Kashmir had was removed. That is something that Indians have been discussing for decades, ever since independence. But Modi did that, and that sort of thing appeals to a large body of people, even those who are not fundamental Hindus. That appeals to them, and that for them shows that Modi is building an India. And it doesn't matter if a few Muslims are unhappy, and you need a distinct ideology to emerge, a distinct set of values to emerge, saying yes, we can fight Modi. Because in a way, if you like, the great Congress era under Nehru and Mrs. Gandhi was built on state control of the economy. That has gone, though Modi has actually not made as many changes in the economy as he promised, and the prosperity of the Indian people has not greatly increased. So you need somebody to emerge to say yes, Modi is doing this, and also a leader who can explain that India's world standing. Modi was going to recast India's world relations. He's got very friendly with Netanyahu in Israel. He tried to become friendly with Trump, but who can be friendly with Trump? You can't predict what he's going to do. And take, for instance, India. India is now has a very difficult relationship with China. The border area is very tense. So Modi's foreign policy hasn't worked. So you can get a leader who could construct a policy, but the leader, I can't see one emerging at the moment.
In terms of what's been happening inside India, we've heard a lot of concern about illiberalism, intolerance, in international indices of press freedom. India is slipping down in terms of the health of its democracy. It's slipping down the table. Yet India remains a robust democracy, and the only exception in its 70-odd years was when Indira Gandhi, a Congress leader, introduced the emergency and locked up, among many others, leaders of what was to become the BJP.
Indeed, Mrs. Gandhi. I was in India then. I'd gone back from this country for a few years to live in India, and I saw the emergency and how quickly everybody accepted Mrs. Gandhi's dictatorial rule, saying it was wonderful, it was going to bring prosperity to India. And Mrs. Gandhi said, "Don't talk too much, work hard." And they said, "Indians talk too much, and this is wonderful," and things like that. And yet, but at this stage, while Modi hasn't gone that far. If you look at what he is doing with the press in India, the press is getting increasingly tightly controlled. And I mentioned it in the book. I spoke to a very prominent journalist representing one of India's great newspapers, and he was very critical of Modi. And when I wanted to quote him in the book, he said, "Please don't do that," And he was fearful. And that I haven't seen since the emergency. In the emergency time, of course, nobody said anything against Mrs. Gandhi. Indira is India, and so on, and they parroted those slogans. But Modi is slowly moving, and certainly not quite. The people are not being arrested and put in bars and sense under the emergency, but he's exercising a tight control of the press, and this means that the critical analysis, and Andrew, you know India so well, and the press in India has always been very raucous and always talked about politics. The press in India now is very different, and Modi is also using government power. The government has powers of advertisement and so on to make the press bend to his will in a way that we haven't seen since the emergency.
And there's also a simple vindictiveness that people who run platforms or newspapers or television networks which are critical of Modi suddenly find they're under investigation for alleged income tax irregularities, all sorts of stuff like that. But another question's come in. The US is helping India fight against China. Do you think there's a good chance of India being a world power in the future? And that's a question from you, Parkinson.
Well, I'm not sure the US is actually helping India fight China. I mean, India and China have had a border skirmish, not a war. I remember the 1962 war when China swept in and defeated India very humiliatingly out in the northeast frontier. But the US has, yes, it has made noises about friendship with India. It has tilted towards India in the way it didn't in the 50s, when basically it was a great fan of Pakistan, a great supporter of Pakistan. But actually, the US, maybe under Biden, this may happen. Biden seems to be taking, whereas Trump was difficult to say what Trump would do. Every morning he'd get up at 5, and you didn't know which way his tweets would go. But Biden may be taking a much more a strong stance towards China, and may move a bit closer to China. But I can't see America always backing India with respect to China. India has to first of all, India has to accept that it will never be a power as great as China. It has to take second place to China in Asia. But India also has to improve its relationship with Pakistan, which have become disastrous now under Modi, and build an alliance with other countries in that bloc, which at the moment Modi hasn't quite succeeded in doing.
So his foreign policy, Indian foreign policy, has always been a bit brittle. But of course, India is a nuclear power. As you say, uh, relations with Pakistan remain deeply, deeply troubled, though there is a new ceasefire along the ceasefire line in Kashmir, which offers a little bit of hope. But in terms of malleability, how does the West put some influence on Modi to be, in Western terms, a little bit more of a statesman?
Well, I think the first thing the West must do is actually learn a bit more about Modi. I mean, Andrew, you reported from India, and okay, you got Space and Time on the BBC, but apart from the BBC, and even then, that's not a great deal. India is not reported all that much. In the whole of the COVID thing, India is being now reported because vaccines are not available from India. But apart from that, this country, the West's reporting about India, despite the fact that it's the world's largest democracy, has always confined to Western interests. It needs to understand Modi, it needs to understand India. And when it does that, and what has happened with Modi, it's very interesting, as we saw with David Cameron and the Conservative Party particularly, they have courted Modi in order to help them in this country. For instance, the Conservative Party, have been historically being pro-Muslim and anti-Hindu, have decided that the Hindu vote in this country is there. We have 3 Hindu ministers in the British cabinet, which would have absolutely amazed Winston Churchill, and therefore they are using it for their own political ends rather than using it to know India and influence India.
Indeed, it's quite possible that very soon, or not very soon, but in the next few years, Britain will have a prime minister of Indian descent. I mean, we've got Rishi Sunak, we've got Priti Patel, we've got others who are certainly ambitious for that role. But in terms of looking into the crystal ball, which I know is a difficult and dangerous question to ask, but let me do it. How long do you think Narendra Modi will remain as India's leader, and how do you think his time as India's leader may come to an end?
Well, certainly Modi will stand for the next election and try and win 3 elections in a row, which hasn't been done since the days of Nehru.
But he's
But
get's getting on a bit, isn't he now? He's not a young
he's
man.
he's getting on a bit, but he says he's got a 56-inch chest and so on and so forth. So maybe he's Superman. He's like Lord Krishna who goes on and on. But who knows? But even Modi will have to go, and that is where an opportunity could be provided, because there isn't another BJP leader like Modi who appeals beyond the party to a large section of the population. That
But
is
people,
where, if you
but people talk about Amit Shah, who is the home minister and quite a muscular figure, very close to Modi, as a potential successor, somewhat in the Narendra Modi style.
I don't know. It's possible, but I don't see Amit Shah in that style. I don't think he has that Modi appeal. He hasn't that ability to sell himself. He's much more of a hard man. He's much more of a machine politician who runs Modi sends him whenever he needs to win elections, organize things, and so on. He's good at that. But as a front man, I don't think he can match up to Modi, and that would be the opportunity for a leader to merge. But the problem is, and you know this, Andrew, the best people in India don't go into politics. You know, the smartest and the shrewdest don't go into politics. You might well say that is true of other countries as well.
I was just about to say that, yeah.
but they don't go into politics, and therefore, and Modi, in that sense, despite his lack of education and so on, is actually an incredibly smart and shrewd person.
So
And
you
that is
admire
why.
him?
Well, I admire him in the sense when he came to power, of course, I wouldn't have voted for him, but when he came to power, I did feel, yes, that section of the population hasn't been heard. We have a Congress party, which is a family party. And really, just because you're the grandson of or great grandson of Jawaharlal Nehru and you just carry on, I mean, that's not the way it should be. But what has terribly disappointed me, and some of Modi's ideas, like saying, one must have proper toilets in the country and so on, or make India clean. For instance, when Modi, the first speech he made in Varanasi, and when he won power, he didn't talk of politics. He talked about how he talked to addressed the audience and said how they could help him clean the country. I mean, those were good ideas. So even the toilets he's built, they have been built, are not being used properly by everyone, it seems. But those are good ideas. But where I think I, of course, part company with Modi is trying to convert India from a secular country into a country where it's a Hindu state, and where Hinduism is the state religion.
Yeah, indeed. I think you've put that extremely well. And one thing where I'd very strongly agree with Mihir on is that actually Narendra Modi is not very well understood, particularly in the West. He's not, the BJP is not particularly well understood. And I'd commend Mihir Bose's new book as a way of seeking to address that gap. So it's Narendra Modi, the Yogi of Populism, and it's published by Bite-Sized Books. It's available for £5.99, or the Kindle version is £2.99. And Mihir, many thanks for joining us today and for this, I hope, worthwhile and illuminating discussion.
Thank you, Andrew.